pause while I do that. That's why.
All right.
But I'm going to go ahead and introduce. Hello and welcome. My name is Elora Morris. I am the Communications Marketing and Outreach Coordinator here at Howard EcoWorks. And I want to thank you all for coming and welcome you to our presentation, From Sapling to Survivor, How to Keep Trees Healthy and Thriving, with our speaker, Shoshana Cook. We will begin momentarily, but I want to take a moment to introduce our organization, Howard EcoWorks. We are an environmental nonprofit serving the Baltimore region. We engage and educate the community about environmental sustainability and restoration while creating pathways to green jobs through our workforce development programs. What that looks like is we build conservation gardens with native plants and plant trees that benefit habitat, pollinators, and biodiversity while providing green industry job training to our seasonal conservation crews. There are many ways to stay involved with our organization. All of you here today are on our monthly newsletter list. Our emails include updates on our conservation work, opportunities for educational events such as this webinar, hiring opportunities, and volunteer calls. You can also learn more about us by visiting our website at howardecoworks.org. We do have some exciting opportunities coming up. We recently acquired a new property in Glenwood called Holly Hills. We are slowly transitioning our operations, office, and nursery to this location, which has been spread out in 3 locations. We are so excited to eventually be in one central location. And we also have plans to restore, rehabilitate the land and the existing forest on the property. Eventually, we want a sustainably designed building we can use as our offices, community center to host in-person events and classes. If you would like to be a part of this exciting new journey, we have a volunteer cleanup opportunity on Holly Hills on December 7th, and you can sign up online by visiting our website's volunteer tab, or you can donate to our Giving Tuesday fundraiser, which is fundraising to install a new water well that will support our nursery operations and future building needs. Again, all of this information and ways to support are available on our website. Alrighty. And one last time, just keep your mics on mute. If you'd like to protect your privacy while we're recording, you can just turn off your video. We will take questions at the end, so please use the little chat box to ask us questions, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. And I want to once again thank all of you for showing up today to learn about how to care for trees. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Shoshana Cook, our natural resource specialist. Shoshana has a bachelor's degree in biology, concentrating in ecology and evolution from Penn West Clarion. Shoshana is also a licensed tree expert in Maryland, has the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professional Certification Level 2, has 7 years of experience working with native plants, and managed several thousand trees for Tree Montgomery. So you can use your little clap emojis to welcome Shoshana, and I am now going to pass the mic off to Shoshana.
Okay. Thank you. Hello. Nice to meet you all. Sorry, I have 2 video screens, so I'm looking up at one and I'm looking down at the other, and I need to look at both. So sorry if I look a little bit like that, but that's what's gonna happen. So welcome to trees. This is what we're gonna cover. And so trees are just really beneficial. I think a lot of people just kind of look at them and it's a sea of green and they don't realize what they're doing for you, but they are very important for ecosystems. They provide food and shelter for hundreds of species of animals. They suck up floodwater. They fix air pollution. They put shade. And here's a little bit bigger slide so you can see this. So a tree's body is half water that it sucked up, and the rest of it is pretty much just made out of carbon dioxide. So its body is entirely made out of air pollution and stormwater runoff. And they provide mental health benefits, which are proven in research studies. You reduce stress, reduce blood pressure, beautify your community. It provides a peaceful environment. Birds. Look at how many birds a tree can support. You need 7,500 caterpillars just for one clutch of chickadees. And there's a lot of bugs living on the trees, and that's actually important, and you need that. Entomologist Doug Tallamy says the white oak at Quercus alba, which is the state tree of Maryland actually, and the number 1 in oaks, which are already all champions for supporting biodiversity, but white oak is the #1 for how many species it supports. Just butterflies and moths, caterpillars alone, 537 species. And about 90 species of wild animals eat its acorns. And there's other bugs that live on it too, it's not just caterpillars. So these trees are doing some heavy lifting. And trees can increase your property values up to 20%. They take a long time to grow, so I think sometimes people know that when they're buying a house. Like if you plant a tiny tree, you may be waiting 30 years for that to grow, so they want one with already a mature tree. They can also reduce the cost of your heating and provide shade in the summer, and reduce the cost of air conditioning as well. In fact, they can reduce your energy bill by 25% if you put them in the right place. So you can go to that link if you're interested in finding out more about how to put them in the right place. It depends on where you live. Like if you live in a desert, you're putting trees in a different strategic position, but you can use them to shade your air conditioner, is one thing. And as windbreaks. And when you're getting a tree, then you have to decide what kind of tree am I getting and where am I going to put it. Do I want to not see my neighbor? Do I want to not have a really windy house? Do I just want a really nice looking house or to support native animals? What kind of soil do I have? How wet is it? How much light am I getting? How much space do I have for the tree? And that helps you select the right species that lives in those kinds of environments that you have. And here's the same slide a little bit bigger so you can see it. You want to put all trees 5 feet away from underground utilities like electric and gas lines, and you want to call this utility before you dig so you find out where those are. And for larger trees that are going to grow maybe 30, 40, 50 or more feet high when they're adults, you want to put those 30 feet away from a high voltage electric line, 10 feet away from your house, and 10 feet away from other large trees. If you've got a really small understory tree, they have usually evolved to grow under other trees, and it's okay to put them closer. They like being in the shade. Not every species, but that's why that rule is just for large trees. And never put them in the septic field, because it'll destroy the pipes. So that's that. And try to put them a little away from the sidewalk if you can. And here's how to plant a tree. You dig a hole that's the same depth as the root ball, but twice as wide. You're putting the tree straight up in the hole so it's not leaning. You're putting it so that the root flare is right at the same level as the ground over here. Do you see that? There's the grass. Do you see my mouse? Anyway, this is the root flare. That's where the tree starts widening out. Instead of being a 90 degrees up and down trunk, it's widening out and flattening out toward the soil. That's the root flare or root collar. You want to line that up with the flat ground. And then you're putting the local soil back around the tree. You're putting 2 to 3 inches of mulch 3 inches away from the tree, not burying the tree in mulch. And you're adding stakes to the tree to keep it straight if necessary, if you think it might has a chance of leaning over or falling in the wind, if you have a high wind area, or maybe it has very small roots for the tree and you think it might lean over. We actually do those as a standard practice for all our plantings, just in case. And you are going to put a deer net that's 4 feet high, or a cage, so that deer can't scratch off its bark and kill it. And now you have a new tree. How are you going to water it? You're going to water it a few gallons 3 times a week for the first 2 weeks, 2 times a week for weeks 3 and 4, and once a week for weeks 5 and 6. And if you have a heavy rain, that does count as a watering. You can skip a watering at that time. If your tree is planted within its first 6 weeks of life in the winter, you still need to water it right after planting. Watering it right after planting is the most critical. Oh, you can't see the mouse. Okay, thank you for telling me that. But anyway, if the winter is, I tried to describe where the root collar is. I hope you understood that. But if in the winter, if it's within 6 weeks of planting, you can still water the tree. You don't need to water it quite as strictly as like 3 times a week, 2 times a week, once a week in winter, because they are dormant. but it does help it to regulate its temperature to have somewhat moist soil. So if you notice that it hasn't rained or snowed for a couple of weeks, you can water it once the temperature is above freezing that day, so you're not watering it with something that turns immediately to ice. And the reason that you're watering trees is because the tree was either grown in a pot in a nursery where its roots can't really grow big and don't really want to grow that big because it's getting watered all the time, so it doesn't have to go to the trouble to extend long roots and find its own water, and it's getting fertilizer, and its roots are just too small to support the tree once it's out in the ground. Or you've got a tree that's in a ball and burlap sack, and 50 to 90% of its roots have just been cut off to fit it into that sack. And the time that it takes for the roots to grow back is 1 year per inch of caliper that the tree has. And caliper is how wide the tree is at 6 inches off the ground. So that's what you're looking for recovery rate. And you're going to be watering the tree in the summer. Now, 2 years is an estimate. You're really watering it 1 year for every inch of caliper it has when you planted it. But let's say 2 years, it's not going to hurt it. Water the tree 10 to 12 gallons once a week in the summer when it's really hot, from 4th of July to Labor Day. Or if it starts getting hot earlier, then water it then too. And water the tree as well if it's wilting. After 2 years, or if you planted an especially large tree, then after how many inches of caliper it had when you planted it, it should be okay. You shouldn't need to water it anymore. But keep an eye on it if there's a big drought. And if it's a Howard EcoWorks tree, we will be emailing you instructions on how to take care of it. But this is how, though. So when you're watering the tree, you're watering in the whole mulch circle, you're watering under the drip line of the tree, and you're watering slowly enough that the mulch and soil are not blasting off and making holes and erosion. And you're not only watering right at the base of the tree, because you do want it to stretch its roots out and be motivated to grow longer roots and be able to support itself. And here's some different watering methods that you can choose. If you want, you can have a drip line. That's that coil on the left. That's watering really slowly. It's pretty hard to tell how much water the tree is getting with those, but at least it's slow. You can do a tree gator, which is that green kind of plastic bag looking one. Those are excellent for watering the tree slowly. However, if you leave it on all year, it can make the bark moldy. So the recommendation is to take those off between waterings. You can also use any kind of standard 5-gallon construction bucket. You know what I'm talking about. Like pickles come in them. Home Depot has them. All those buckets are 5 gallons. You can drill little holes in the bottom. And that's a good slow way to water your tree, as well as knowing that if you filled that bucket one time, that is 5 gallons of water, so you know how much you're watering the tree. You can also achieve knowing how much you water the tree by getting a hose and filling an empty gallon of something and seeing how long it takes to fill the gallon with the hose speed that you're using. There's also this little tree IV thing. That's a 5-gallon bucket, but it's got a little tap that's going into the roots. Be careful when you're installing that not to pierce a large root, but otherwise it is useful. And mulching. Why should you mulch the tree? It protects the roots from extreme temperature fluctuations, both in the winter and in the summer. It retains moisture. As the mulch breaks down, it feeds the tree. It suppresses weeds. It improves the quality of your soil because it is turning into soil. And it keeps mowers and trimmers away from the tree because there's not grass growing right there, so you don't have a reason to go accidentally hit the tree with a mower or a trimmer. But you are keeping the mulch 3 inches away from the trunk. It should look like a donut, not a volcano or an anthill. And some good alternatives to mulch are leaves or wood chips. And here's some tree staking. Stake ties keep the tree from falling over before it can establish enough roots to hold itself up. Not every tree needs one, but you have to kind of keep an eye on the tree if you're not going to put one on it. So Howard EcoWorks does install these as standard practice, and that's fine. But it's kind of like when you have a broken leg and your muscles are weakening, it does do that to the tree. It doesn't let it build up strength against wind as much. So you want to take those off after a year, both so that the tree can start becoming stronger on its own, and so that they don't end up getting outgrown and strangling the tree. So the only times that you would not take these off after a year is if you come back to the tree and it is leaning heavily and needs a stake tie to correct which way it's pointing, or if you wiggle the trunk gently and you see roots moving around in the bottom, which is really rare. It's usually well established after a year. But if you see that, then it still needs stakes because for some reason it's unstable. So, and these should not loop all the way around the trunk because that strangles the tree faster. See how it's going, it's touching part of the trunk and then it's just going looping all the way around and touching the stake. So that's the right way to do it. I've seen some other people do it the wrong way with metal that's just wrapping all the way around the tree. Just don't let your landscaper do that stuff. And you should put the tree stakes outside of the root ball so it's not piercing the roots of the tree. It already has little enough. So here's some tree cages. They're gonna stay on the tree for a long time, probably 6 or more years. So be ready to expect that. They're 4-foot high cages so that deer cannot rub the tree. And they need to stay on until the tree is at least 4 inches wide at 4.5 feet high, which is called diameter breast height. That's 4.5 feet high on a tree. If it still fits in the cage, it's still going to offer it some protection so it can stay on longer than that. That's not hurting the tree as long as it's not getting strangled by the cage or bumping a bunch of branches into it. And sometimes the cage is plastic deer fencing. You have to keep more of an eye on those because the trees outgrow them sooner. Sometimes they outgrow them sooner than they're ready to be without deer protection, and then you have to cut the zip ties on it and put looser zip ties to keep that deer cage on. Against beaver, the cage needs to be metal. It can't be the plastic deer cage then, and against beaver, you're keeping it on for as long as possible. It needs to be 3-4 feet high against beaver, but if you get a heavy snowfall, they can climb the 3-foot high cage, so that's why 4 is still better against beavers. Cages can open. I've seen a lot of clients remove the cages because they get frustrated with them that they can't weed inside the cage, they can't mow inside the cage. You can open the cage and put a weed whacker in there, but be very careful not to hit the trunk of the tree with the weed whacker if you're doing that. And this is how, if you need to, you can put a little guard around it to keep it from getting damaged by the weed whacker. Because you can cut off half of the tree's circulation system really fast doing this by accident. You can also use a 2-liter soda bottle if you want a cheap method to protect it from the weed whacker. Because the circulation system of a tree is only going up and down. So if you cut the trunk sideways, that's how much of the circulation system it just lost. When it grows a sealing, like it can seal the wound. If you're lucky, it can seal the wound all the way. If it seals the wound all the way, it grows the circulation system back in that area, but it's still going to have damage and maybe rot under there. Because the middle of every tree is always just dead wood, and it can't kill any mold or anything that goes in that part. It's kind of like trying to kill mold on your hair. And this is how to mulch. Once again, mulch volcanoes can rot the bark off the tree. It can rot the entire circulation system off if it rots all the bark off all the way around. Mulch should be 2 to 3 inches deep and 3 inches away from the tree. And there's this pointing at the visible root flare. See how the tree is widening out at the bottom? You want to see that. A very young tree is not having that visible because they have tap roots like a little carrot. But as the tree gets older, you are going to see a root flare. And that's what a normal tree looks like in the woods. They don't look like they're coming out of an anthill. I know that's very fashionable, but it is killing your tree on purpose to do this. They can also make it grow roots around itself and strangle itself with its own roots in that little area of mulch if it's not rotting its bark off. So it could survive it, but you are taking a chance, and you don't need to. Now, pruning. You don't always have to prune your tree. Like, for real, wild trees are okay, and they can survive, and you don't necessarily have to prune it. But some reasons that you may be pruning a tree is to correct structural problems, dead branches to take those off, which is actually pretty important. Safety, which is again mostly dead branches so they don't fall on you. Clearance, so the tree's branches don't hit you in the head if you're mowing the lawn. Removing suckers and water spouts. Increasing airflow is mostly for like apple farming and things like that. You're not really going to deal with that. And you're also not cutting off this many branches as is read in this picture all at once, because you're not cutting off more than 25% of the canopy, which is the leafy branches of a tree that are still alive, in 1 year. You have to wait if you want to cut more than that. Just gradually cut it over time. And if your tree is too big, probably just choose a different species. Oh, no, that skipped too many. Okay, so when do you prune? If you're doing major pruning, wait until the tree is dormant. So prune basically late fall, winter. That's better, it stresses it out less. But if you've got a dead branch, prune that anytime. If you're pruning a little bit, prune that anytime, it's okay. And every cut should be done when the tree is as young as possible, so it can seal over the wound faster and have a smaller wound. And also, it should be done past the branch collar. So you're leaving the branch collar intact. That's where this tree is kind of widening out where the branch is over there. See that? And then the branch is going out, and it's kind of like looking at the root flare, isn't it? But it's on a branch. So you're leaving the widening part and you're cutting after it, because that helps the tree seal over the wound and it's not damaging the trunk that's behind it. If you cut beyond into that branch collar, you have a danger of cutting the circulation system that's on the trunk. That's not on the branch anymore, that's on the trunk, and you're hurting the tree more than you need to. Here's some tools that you can use for pruning. For small branches, hand pruners are the best. Lopping shears are medium-sized branches, and you're doing a pruning saw for medium and larger branches. And for a large branch, you're also doing multiple cuts. You do one cut past the branch collar to about half of the bottom of the branch. Then past that cut, you do a second cut that's even farther out and just cut the rest of the weight of the branch off. And then you're cutting at the branch shoulder for a large branch, just so it doesn't, if you think it's really heavy and it's going to crack weird and maybe damage the tree as you're cutting it in the middle, that's when you would do that. And this is the majority of pruning should be done when trees are young. You can see on the left there, that's a bit of decay from a dead branch. You don't want to let that spread, so the sooner the tree can seal over it, the better. Here's some elevation pruning. These branches are really low. They wanted people to be able to walk on the sidewalk. That's a common reason to prune a tree. Here's some crown reduction pruning. You probably chose the wrong species of trees for your area if you need to do this, or you're growing an apple tree or something like that where you're making it short on purpose so you can still reach the crops. So you're probably not going to need to do this, but this is how to do it correctly. Because if you're not doing this, then what you're doing is topping, which makes trees look horrible and it's extremely unhealthy for them. What you're aiming for is to reduce, if you are having to reduce it, to reduce branches to the next side branch that's coming off, and the next side branch being at least as third as wide as the branch that you just cut off. So not like a tiny little branch or nothing after it, like you're treating it like a bush, because you end up with this, and it's really unhealthy for the tree. This is usually, you see this with landscapers that are doing something wrong, sorry, or people who are clearing electric lines, because they have to cut certain parts of the tree so that it doesn't grow into the electric line. That's why it's better to plant shorter trees right there, but sometimes that's just not what happened. And here's some crown thinning. Again, you're probably not going to do this because you're not farming apples or anything, but if trees have branches that are crossing each other, then you can cut those. They don't really matter unless they're rubbing against the trunk, though. You don't want the trunk to get a branch growing onto it, rubbing it with wind, damaging it. So those are important to cut off. Any other branches you'd cut off if they're growing vertical, like they're little water spouts like this. this is the sign that the tree is stressed. Maybe it's getting eaten by deer, maybe it got wounded, maybe it's buried too deep and so its branches are growing from the ground because it didn't want to be underground in that part. This is basically, I think I'm dying, I'd better grow 20 more trunks. You need to examine the tree if it's doing this and see where the damage is. If it's damaged, like for real, it's like maybe 75% of the trunk just got rubbed off by a deer, you might want to select the biggest branch that it grew out of the roots and let it grow. Let it grow another trunk because it needs it. But most of the time you can cut these off. This is called epicormic growth, or water spouts, suckers. Usually they just waste the tree's energy. It's stressed and it's doing this, and it actually can provide a natural deer protection because the deer can't get past a whole barrier of like a bush of little branches. But it does waste the tree's energy to grow this many trunks. It may turn it into more of a bush-like shape depending on how bad this problem is, and usually people just don't like to look at it for aesthetics. And usually the tree isn't so badly off that it actually needs these. Sometimes it can even do it from drought stress. But examine it first. So here's some common problems of trees. Codominant stems. This is something that you would prune for if the nursery didn't get it before you. If you see as young as possible, correct this if it's close to your house. If it has 2 or more trunks and they look like they're the same width, they're the same height, they didn't decide which trunk is going to win, cut 25% off the top of one so that the other wins. You want to have one trunk close to your house because trees blow in the wind in different directions from each other. So if one trunk is going one way, the other trunk is going the other way. Once the tree is big, they can crack apart and fall, and it can fall on your property and damage something. It's kind of dangerous. It's not always dangerous, but at that point you might need to get an arborist to tie them together with like metal tent ties so they blow the same way in the wind so they don't crack apart. That like once it's a large tree like that, you probably need to examine it if it's close to your house with an arborist that specializes in that kind of stuff. However, for a small tree, it doesn't matter because it's never going to hurt you. It can't get big enough that it can fall on your property and damage it. And for things like magnolia and serviceberries and things, they grow multi-stems all the time. They're kind of bushes at the same time as being trees. So those are okay. You can leave small trees having multi-stems. Dogwood doesn't matter. Red buds doesn't matter. They're never going to get big enough to hurt you, and they do that naturally. And here's some common problems with trees. What happens if you take your deer cage off and you have some deer? They like to rub the itchy velvet off their antlers in the winter and do this to trees. It's missing half of its circulation system. That wound is actually so big on that tree on the left that it's never going to seal over it all the way. That tree is going to be stunted forever, probably die fast, definitely introduce mold and rot into the middle of the tree and make it unstable. They also like to mark their territory, so the deer is going to keep coming back again and again to the same tree and rub all its bark off. Maybe not all of it, but they do significant damage, and they love trees 1 to 3 inches diameter breast height the most. And here's some more deer rubbing damage. Again, this tree can't really recover from that fully either. You can see around the edges the wound is trying to seal. That rounded stuff is the tree trying to seal over the wound, but it just hasn't managed to do that all the way. And as it ages, it's going to seal over it more, but this wound is so big that it doesn't look like the tree is going to be able to seal over it all the way. Here's some other common problems. This is what happens if you run into the tree with a weed whacker. It cut off the circulation system, but at the bottom. This is lower than a deer can reach. So this is weed whacker or lawnmower damage. Look at the tree on the left is missing half or over half of its circulation system, and it hasn't managed to grow it back. It looks like it's not even trying to seal the wound, it's just rotten. Here's another common problem. This is what happens if you don't look at the tree after you planted it. This is like you left it abandoned for 6, 7, 10 years, 3 years maybe. It had a really tight tree support. This one happens to be metal. It was wrapped around the tree. The tree could not move it out of the way, so it started absorbing it. This can girdle the tree, which is cutting off its circulation system and strangling it. It can make it unstable. It can introduce rot. And it's just like, look at that. Like you don't want that. You can look instinctively at that and know that you don't want that. So that's why we look at the tree at least like once every year and see how it's doing. And if you actually see this, if you want to be, a good Samaritan, try to cut that off. Cut as much of it as you can off so it stops strangling the tree. It doesn't need this. This is just hurting it at this point. After 1 year, these stakes that's supporting it, the stake ties can come off. Here's another common problem. This is a leaning stake. I don't know when this tree was planted. Actually, this tree, the stake tie is ready to come off because I know this was planted over a year ago. But if it wasn't planted over a year ago, you just want to hammer that stake in and leave the stake tie, tying it to the tree. If it was planted over a year ago, remove the stake tie, tying it to the tree. Just leave the stake supporting the cage, but still hammer it back up so it's straight. You want to be wiggling the stakes to make sure that they are not loose, they're not leaning over, and just kind of monitor how your trees are doing. And here's another different problem: weeds and invasive species. Invasive vines like to wrap around the trees and girdle them. You can see this vine on the left has been on the tree for so long that it couldn't grow in that area and it's getting strangled. They also climb up the trees and put a lot of weight on the branches, cut off its access to light, and then when it's winter and there's also snow stressing out the branches or a storm stressing out the branches, it can cause the branches to break more easily because the vines are on there. You want to cut these off. It would be something called a window cut, where you cut the vine at the floor and then cut it again as high as you can reach. This will kill the vine that's up the tree. You have to keep going back and making sure, maybe every year or something, that vines are not continuing to grow up the tree because it'll still be alive on the floor. You can dig it out of the floor if you want to, but that's pretty hard to remove all the vines. You don't want to yank it out of the tree because it can break the tree's branches and it can make something fall on your head. It can make the vine or a tree branch fall on your head and it can damage the tree to do that. Sometimes if the vine is really, really tight, you want to leave it on the tree until it gets rotten and dried up. It's a dead vine, and then the tree can push it off anyway, because sometimes it can damage the tree's bark to get a vine off that's really tight. Sometimes you can do it, especially if honeysuckle has a bark of its own. Honeysuckle bark peels off, so if you know that it's a honeysuckle vine, you can probably peel it off the tree, but just be careful. If you have poison ivy, do not touch it. That climbs up trees too, but it's very hairy. Learn how to identify that. If it's a big root, it's very hairy. And here is some more on how to manage invasive species. There's the person doing a window cut. Shrubs, or things like multiflora rose, it's a shrub, but it's an invasive species, and it acts like a weed and like a vine a little bit. It can climb surprisingly high in the tree. So you want to dig those out if you can, and don't let them be ramps for other vines to climb up the tree more easily. For any tree that's close to your house, you may want to just consider taking all the vines off, even native ones, because it can still do a little bit of instability if it's up in the tree. But if it's far away from your house, that's okay. Might knock off a branch in winter, but we do have native vines and they're usually cooperating with the trees more. So don't cut poison ivy, then window cut the tree, this vine. And removing the vines off the tree is more important than any other taking weeds out from around the tree. Yeah, you don't need to remove poison ivy in the wild. This is only for close to your house, where you're removing every vine. Okay, so that's about 10 to 15 minutes of work, saved the life of the tree. For invasive vines like bittersweet, English ivy, honeysuckle, multiflora rose, you don't want to leave those on the tree. Wisteria. And shrubs you can pull out of the ground. You can use a metal rake to drag thorny bushes without touching them. Be careful with pesticides for real. You should wear thick gloves when you're pulling out weeds, especially thorny ones. And here's some signs and symptoms of declining trees. You may see the leaves being an unusual color that they weren't before. It's maybe dropping its leaves early or dropping its leaves in the summer. It's turning fall colors early. It doesn't have very many leaves on it. The top of the branches are dying back, especially if any of the branches are dying back. Sometimes it's concerning, but sometimes trees kill the bottom branches on purpose just because they're not getting enough light and it's not efficient for the tree. And even if it's not sick, it can do that. But if it's killing the top of its trunk or its top branches, trees don't do that unless they're sick or stressed. If it's got fungus on it, don't worry about lichen so much, but if it's got actual mushrooms or things growing out of the tree, those usually eat dead wood, so you might have a problem and you might want to inspect if there's something going wrong with your tree. Not out of the mulch. Sometimes, I mean, mulch is dead wood, so sometimes mushrooms grow out of that, but if it's growing out of the tree. Now, insects are good. The tree is supporting hundreds of species of insects, and that's good for biodiversity. And it's not going to hurt the tree either, but if you see one species of insect just all over the whole tree, or you know that you have a certain species that's affected by invasives, like emerald ash borer going on an ash tree and you're trying to keep the ash tree alive, or hemlock woolly adelgid, which is like a little fuzzy looking, it acts like an aphid on hemlocks. Those can kill the tree. Keep an eye out for those. If you see woodpeckers on the tree, that's also an indication of dead wood and insects. And if you see water sprouts or epicormic growth, which we discussed earlier, that's those vertical, I'm growing 20 new trunks because I'm stressed out. You want to inspect the tree for what's wrong. And that's about it. So thank you very much for coming here. And do you have any questions?
Yeah, so go ahead and write out any questions that you have in the chat and we will address them. Before you guys go, I do want to say that this is part one of a two-part series. So we are going to have an in-person workshop where you can learn more about how to do some of these techniques. We're still locking down the details, so when we send our follow-up email, you will get an invitation to do part two. So keep an eye out for the email that invites you to part two of this workshop. I see that we have from Pearl, Shujana, and all. This was very informational and both confirmatory and new information. Thank you, Pearl, for your feedback.
Thank you. Okay, hear your
Yes.
heart.
If anybody has any questions, now is the time. We have. All right. So we have a question from Adrian. Can a young black gum that wasn't watered enough recover once the third top of it seems dead?
Probably yes. A lot of trees can recover from a surprising amount of damage. Like sometimes I've seen trees die back to the root and then just grow 20 new trunks, and maybe it's gonna be a bush for a while if you don't cut one off, but like isolate the biggest one. But that's a little bit hard you can't cut all of them off at once without cutting more than 25% of its canopy. So kind of like cut the tips off the other bush ones and let one grow bigger and then gradually remove the bush ones. But it definitely, even if the top third of it died, just like keep on monitoring it, maybe give it some extra support with water, and it should probably still live. Trees can recover from a lot.
Great. Okay, moving
Cut
on.
the dead branches off, though.
Sorry.
Sorry.
So next question from Zosie. Is it okay to plant sedges in a mulch circle?
Yeah, I would say it's fine. You can plant stuff in the mulch circle right up to the tree. I would just be careful that you are digging into tree roots over there, so I would get the smallest plant that I can. And within about 2 feet of the tree, I would probably just get a species that spreads really easily and plant it farther out than 2 feet. Maybe less than 2 feet if you have a small tree, but if you have a larger feet, then like leave the inner 2 feet alone if it's already a big tree. If it's a new tree, maybe like 8 inches or something. try to dig between the roots, plant plugs or bare roots or just the smallest area impact that you can instead of a big potted plant so you're not disturbing roots. And try to do like Paccara or pussy toes or something like that that spreads. Wow, I'm censored. That is a real plant. But so if the like moss flocks or something, it's not going to hurt the tree to have ground cover there, but just don't damage the roots.
Great. Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in. So, next question is from Lori. How can I prune my button bush properly? I cut one branch and then it grows 5 more, so that I have 5 branches to cut the next year.
Well, it is stressed out because it thinks that it's getting eaten. Like, this is the same response that they have if deer are eating them. They just grow a million more branches so the deer can't reach the middle of the bush. So it's going to keep doing that when you prune it no matter what you do, because it noticed that suddenly branches are missing, so I'm getting predated. But you want to cut a branch at a 45-degree angle to the ground, not straight up and down from the ground. Like, don't make it have a flat top. 45-degree angle holds less water, and it lets it rot less, and you want to cut it about a 1/4 inch above a leaf node, just so that it doesn't have a dead piece of branch between leaf nodes. You know what I'm talking about with a leaf node? It's like a little, where little buds are coming out, you see leaves or buds or something like that over there. Don't leave it with a really long piece of just branch with nothing, because the bush is going to kill that part anyway. You're just going to have a dead piece of 2-inch long branch for no reason. So cut it just a little bit past a leaf node. You can it's okay to cut it like perpendicular to the ground, just not parallel to the ground. But sorry, it is going to keep growing back branches. And bushes grow several trunks from the ground anyway, because that's just what they do. Not everyone, but it's not surprising on a bush either, to grow branches back from where you cut it and extra from the ground.
Great. Adrienne, we're going to circle back to your question. I want to make sure that other people have a chance to ask their questions too. So Mary asked, we read that square hole is better than a circular hole for planting a tree because it helps prevent root girdling. Is this true?
If the soil is compacted, there is some research that shows that, yeah. But when you're digging the hole, try to kind of break up the sides with a pickaxe or a shovel or like any tool that you have, so that it's not like a really smooth compacted hole, so that the tree can put its roots out into the ground. And it's probably going to be okay either way, for real. There are I think there are research studies showing that square is better, but maybe not universally true. But also, when you're planting the tree, make sure that it doesn't already have circling roots, because sometimes they come like that from the nursery, especially if it was in a pot before. The roots hit the edge of the pot and circle around. Spread those out if you can when you're planting it, or if you can't spread them out, then consider maybe cutting the circling root off. But don't cut off so much of the roots that the tree dies. Sometimes you just gotta leave it. Yeah, always dig a hole that's twice as big as your pot that you have, or the tree root size that you have, and that's going to help prevent it from being compacted in its hole, because it already has some loosened soil around it. Thank you, Kyle.
It makes me wonder if we want to jump to Craig's question, are there any solutions for a tree planted in compacted soils?
Well, some species of trees can just take that better, and I think at that point, if you know that all of your soil is compacted, you'd just be going for one of those species, like maybe a bald cypress or a black gum, or do some research on what kind of trees can tolerate urban soil very well, because urban soil is often compacted and low quality, low nutrient soil. Honey locust is another one that's good for urban soil, but they have spikes unless you get a cultivar, so those ones can be kind of expensive. Redbud is pretty okay too.
Great. So we're going to go back to Marissa McCurdy asked, we planted several eastern redbuds and they are really top heavy. So much so that some are bending over. I assume we should prune to lighten up the tree, even if it's been over a year. Any specific recommendations? Just take off some of the heavier branches?
You know, that's a really unusual problem. I haven't seen them do that, but yeah, I guess so. If it's so heavy that it's leaning over, it's actually not going to hurt it to have a leaning over branch, but if you don't want it to look like that, yeah, I guess prune some of the weight off. Just be careful not to take more than 25% of the canopy off at once.
Okay. All right. And we're going to go back to Adrian Hubbard, who asked, also, can you speak about how much to correct or cut circling roots when planting?
Okay, so as much as you can, try to straighten these out instead of cutting them, because it is damaging the tree. But if it's a really big root and you need to cut it back from circling, I would say don't cut back more than 25% circumference of the tree at once. Then wait a year and come back and cut some more of the root. You might need to, some trees I've seen are like mature trees planted somewhere in along the street, and they have 100% circling roots, and the circling roots will eventually girdle it. You can kind of tell that that's happening because that you can maybe see the root circling around, or the tree's trunk is flattening at that area because it can't really grow there. If it is girdling about 20-25% of the tree only, I wouldn't be super concerned about it. If it's girdling like 50% of the tree, I'm concerned. If it's girdling the whole tree, I'm very concerned, but you can't cut them off all at once. You can also cut the 20-25% off one. It's actually better to cut off any girdling root if you can, the circling roots, but it's just also risky for the tree. So sometimes I'm just weighing risk versus benefit, and if it's a really big root, I'd just rather not touch it and hurt the tree.
Are there any more questions? If you have any questions, please ask away. In this moment, I will remind we will have an in-person workshop. So definitely keep an eye out for that email when it comes along.
We're going to be maintaining some trees.
Great. Okay. Yeah, Shoshana, I don't know if you have any more else you want to say on that topic or anything that came up in the conversations here in the
Okay, so I guess like compacted soil, if you have the luxury of doing this and there's like maybe nothing else growing over there, or it's just lawn or something like that, I might actually amend the soil. I might like take a tiller and like till up all the soil and amend it with some better soil a little bit near the tree. But it's possible. That's a lot of work. It's possible to not do that and just dig twice as big as the pot and choose a tree that can take compacted soil.
I know that when we do our tree plantings at Howard Eco Works, we do generally add compost mix in when we dig our hole out, and then we will add compost mix. Or sometimes we even have biochar mix because we work with different organizations that supply biochar, or we were part of a biochar research study earlier this year. We have some very fascinating articles that we wrote on that. Great. We have some comments that people made. Adrian had mentioned that some nurseries limit the red buds too much, which may explain why the tree was heavy. And also said, good topic and thank you. Kyle said, amend it with gypsum. It will also help break up the soil. And Lori said, great job, Shoshana. Thank you. Thank you also to our funders, Chesapeake Bay Trust and our National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Yes.
Thank you. And yeah, amending the soil does help the tree, especially if you have very poor soil or urban soil. It's worth it to put some compost in there, or some biochar and compost. The biochar helps keep the nutrients from washing away some.
Pearl, do you have a question? I was typing it out to you. If it's easier for you to unmute your mic, you can do that. If writing or typing is not an option. I saw a hand come up. Maybe it was a false alarm. Oh, it was by accident.
Okay.
I didn't mean to put the spotlight on you. We still have a few more minutes, so we'll stick around here if anybody does have any questions. And again, if you guys ever have any further questions, you want to break this down, please send us an email. We'll be happy to answer questions on not just trees, but native plants as well. We do have our nursery, Seeds of Change, which is actually having a 20% off end of season sale. You can get our website and check that out. There's a little code. But yes, if you have any questions on, yes, Lori included our email, info@howardecoworks.org. Please ask us questions about trees, native plants, conservation methods. We tend to have expertise in rain gardens, managing stormwater through natural solutions, pollinator gardens, and things like that. So there's many different ways to address stormwater solutions with natural solutions, but rain gardens and pollinator gardens and tree plantings are big takeaways there. So please reach out to us if you have any questions on ways that you want to improve not just your yard, but the environment that is around you. We'll be happy to help.
And I do tree inspections if you want.
Yes. Oh, yes. Are there apps that would help to schedule watering of trees? That's a good question, Dave.
That is a good question.
I wonder. I know that there's like cute little plant watering apps and things like that. I wonder if you can. I don't know.
I've never had a specific app for that, but so I don't really know a good answer to that, but I think you can set timers even on like a basic regular cell phone. You can just set timers for like go off every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday or something like that, and just name the timer tree watering, and I think you're pretty set and don't have to pay any money for that.
If it hasn't been invented, that's a good idea.
That is a good idea, yeah. And with local weather monitoring, that would be really good. That would be a good app. That's a really good question. I wish that existed. Kyle says lots of sensors you can buy that connect to apps that base off your soil moisture. Mm-hmm. So Kyle is a professional.
Yeah. Do you have anything maybe to say on like picking good tree species? I feel like that would be a good quick. I know a couple of people have already left the meeting, but
okay,
that might be a good final note.
No, you know what? It is true that native species survive better in our environments, although it depends where you plant them. If it's like a very dry area, then a swamp species would probably die anyway, but native species generally need less pest care, less maintenance, less watering, and survive better and support native animals more. They can use them more than a random species that's from a different continent that they may not be able to use. So I would suggest that. But, I mean, I do like growing food, so it's tempting to grow like fruit trees and stuff as well. But those a lot of fruit trees have a lot of pest problems, so I guess prepare yourself for that if you're doing that. What's some like? It depends what you want. Like, do you want a short species with a lot of flowers on it? Do you want something that grows really fast? Do you want to not see your neighbor? You can get an arborvitae for that. Redbuds are pretty hardy. They're in the legume family, so they're more or less a bean. And they can amend their own soil with nitrogen fertilizer because they can invite nitrogen-fixing bacteria into their roots. So that's pretty nice. You can see them surviving some pretty harsh conditions. However, they are not a very tall tree. They grow up to about 20 or 30 feet tall. And they don't live for a super long time. Maybe their average life is about 20 years. Although I have seen a botanical garden grow one from 1960 over and over again, because every time that it died and got like bacterial or fungal masses in its body, then they let it come back from the root and selected the biggest epicormic branch and grew back a whole other tree from that. But
well, we basically have 2 minutes left. We're going to stay in the call. If you guys want to drop down your favorite tree in the chat, go ahead, let us know. You know, tree lovers for life.
You know what else is good for like urban soil and stuff? Black gums. Black gums are pretty good.
That's really
That
cool.
can survive a lot. That's maybe like 50 feet tall. They have really nice red leaves in the fall.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thanks for hanging out and asking really great questions, and listening today and taking the time to learn about trees.
Thank you for
I hope you
coming.
guys will go forth and be great environmental stewards to your community, and spread the word to help teach other people what you know and all that jazz. So thank you so much. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay. Well,
I'm gonna skedat. It's 1.
all right. I guess I'll end the recording and hang up.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Susanna.
Bye. Thank you for coming.
Mm.